Hello YouTube, this is DVD Review Studios here, and today I shall be doing a collection video looking at the animated world of Star Wars on Blu-ray, which of course we have the most recognizable animated property from Star Wars, which is Star Wars The Clone Wars, the CGI animated show, the follow-up successor to that series, Star Wars Rebels, which I thought was very good. And then we also have some extra inclusions here, including expanded media with a comic set and a novel for the Clone Wars. And then we also have the Genndy Tartakovsky original Clone Wars animated DVDs, which are definitely worth talking about. And for good measure, with this obviously being all prequel era related, I thought I'd also throw in the prequels to talk about briefly as well. So without further ado, let us look through the Blu-ray sets, beginning with the 1 through to 5 box set of the Clone Wars. So here is the 1 through to 5 Blu-ray box set for the Clone Wars, which of course contains the vast majority of the series. It doesn't include the 2008 theatrical movie, sadly I've had to buy that separately, and it obviously doesn't have the Lost Missions season 6, or the Disney Revival final season, which is season 7, so those aren't included. But if you're looking for the bulk of the show, this set normally goes for about £40 in total, which is more or less what I paid for it anyway. But some of these Clone Wars sets, especially the Clone Wars movie, for whatever reason, randomly spike in value here and there. I've seen the singular theatrical movie disc go for about maybe £30 at an absolute maximum, and with this set I've seen it go for near enough almost triple figures, which is kind of concerning, but it's normally available for about £40, maybe £50 at an absolute push if you really wanted to get hold of it. And in terms of value for money, I definitely think I've got my entertainment value from this particular set. And so, looking at the individual seasons here that are included, first up we have Season 1 here with Commander Cody on the front cover. This one is a 3-disc set, and the majority of these are 3-disc sets apart from Season 5. So in terms of Season 1, this is where the show began as obviously the Cartoon Network show that was aimed at a child demographic, which still retained the violence and obviously the situation surrounding the prequel era of Star Wars. But with this season, overall, it's quite childish and actually quite out of sync in terms of the episodes not really making too much sense in the viewing order that they are delivered in. So for the 22 episodes that you get on here, they're not in story order, and that's something that drastically changed along with the audience, or the target audience that this went for. So with this coming out in 2008, I was one that was aware of the show but didn't really grow up with it. But a lot of people that did grow up with the show obviously grew up with the seasons as they came out year by year, and progressively till around, I would say, maybe Season 3, Season 4, that's when the show really started to hit hard in terms of its overall mature demographic, and that's when things definitely changed for the better for this series. And I say that because Season 1, in terms of its chronology, the storyline is all over the place. And that really goes for both Season 1, and I would arguably say both Season 2 and 3 as well. So Season 1 has some of the more interesting storylines in terms of the older side of the prequel era, but with this sort of tying very closely to Attack of the Clones, it really just establishes the clone trooper characters, which you can see here with Captain Rex, Cody, and Gree. And this first season overall is very good, especially the finale episode, which introduces the character of Cad Bane. With watching the special features on this particular set, I found it great to actually hear some enthusiasm from Filoni for actually making an episode that seemed a lot more hard-hitting in terms of how violent the show could potentially become. And I think that was where the show sort of branched off in terms of its exploration as to what genres it could really hit home with and how far they could actually take the PG rating that it received. So that also brings to the table another argument which I have here, and that is, what is the best viewing option for the Clone Wars? So with the Clone Wars overall, the first episode chronologically actually begins with Season 2, and that is Season 2, Episode 16. And although that could potentially be viewed as confusing, it really ties into the anthology style of the show, and how with that extra little bit of homework wherever you go out and research the exact list as to how you should view the show, it's definitely a lot more worthwhile in the long run, and that was the way that I personally chose to watch the series, which I'm very thankful that I did do that originally from watching this for the very first time.
This is where the fun begins.
Which is where the chronological viewing option comes into play. So if you were to go in for the chronological viewing order as opposed to the release order that the episodes came out in, you'd be looking at Season 2, Episode 16, then Season 1, Episode 16, and then following up with that, we have the theatrical Star Wars movie from 2008, which is obviously Star Wars The Clone Wars. And so taking a very, very brief sidetrack with the Clone Wars movie, as I really don't want to spend too much time on this was essentially released as a theatrical movie by Lucas because he was very impressed with how the CGI animation was actually coming along, and that's something that really spurred him on to think of the entire series as being more cinematic. And I definitely agree with that, especially with how a lot of the better arcs of the show turned out. But with this in particular, I wasn't overly impressed with it because the childish demographic was definitely very present in this film. But aside from that, it's a very simplistic story of both misunderstandings and trying to return Jabba's son Rotter to Jabba. Who'd have thought Jabba the Hutt would have a son? But there you go. And yeah, this was okay as far as the characters go. In particular, it introduced us to Captain Rex. Obviously, it has introduced us to Ahsoka Tano. And then we also have Asajj Ventress, who briefly appeared in the Tartakovsky Clone Wars miniseries, but she was definitely a lot more fleshed out in this and was probably my favourite part of the Clone Wars movie. And she's definitely one of the better characters, especially towards the latter stages of the Clone Wars show. But that's just a brief look at the Clone Wars movie Blu-ray sets. And so jumping back to Season 2, this is once again a 3-disc set. And in terms of noteworthy episodes, I definitely think the Grievous-related episodes in this season were some of the best overall. The Zillo Beast arc is definitely a noteworthy one, and something that, funnily enough, Dave Filoni actually spoke about bringing back in the Clone Wars much later on. But to be honest, I'm kind of glad they didn't, as the standalone episodes in this season were more than enough for the Zillo Beast arc. And obviously, which I think is probably one of the better story arcs overall, the Holocron heist with Cad Bane. That was definitely one of my favourites and is really our introduction to Cad Bane in terms of chronological order. But there you go, so that is Season 2. And next up is Season 3, which is a season that I am, funnily enough, still yet to review. But this is once again another 3-disc set with some very noteworthy episodes focusing primarily on the Night Sisters, along with Savage Opress, who is Darth Maul's brother. We also have some great noteworthy episodes with the ARC Troopers episode, and then some really interesting bits of information with the Mortis Gods arc. And the special features on here in particular are definitely some of my favourites, and I might review this actually after filming this video, as there's a lot to discuss when it comes to Season 3 that I definitely think is worth discussing overall. Season 4 now, of course, with Darth Maul there pictured on the front cover, which was his resurrection season, as it would be. Once again, another 3-disc set there, and noteworthy episodes on this particular box set. Absolutely the Umbara arc with the Clone Troopers versus General Pong Krell. And then we also have one of the absolute best stories in all of the Clone Wars, in my opinion, and that is the Box arc, with Cad Bane and then Obi-Wan Kenobi going undercover as a bounty hunter by faking his own death, which was overall an incredible story and something that I think would have made an incredible Obi-Wan movie, but that's just my opinion. And last up for the 1 through to 5 box set is, of course, Season 5 with Obi-Wan pictured there on the front cover. This one is only a 2-disc set with 20 episodes in total compared to the normal 22, but I feel this definitely has some of the more darker and more adult-themed episodes compared to the rest of the series. So this season, noteworthy-wise, actually introduced us to the character of Saw Gerrera, who would obviously later transcend into live-action Star Wars, which is quite interesting. We also have the duel episode between both Darth Sidious and Maul and Savage, which is definitely one of the best episodes of the entire Clone Wars series as far as I'm concerned. And then probably the saddest bunch of episodes is where Ahsoka is actually put on trial by the Jedi Council, accused of murder, of all things, which compared to how her character is very early on in the show, you certainly don't expect things to lean towards that direction. And that is for sure one of the most interesting and overall diabolical episodes showing the true colours of the Jedi Council, and easily some of the best storytelling from the cartoon of Star Wars The Clone Wars. So that pretty much wraps it for 1 through to 5. Let's move on to the Lost Missions. And here is the Lost Missions, also known as Season 6, which is the Netflix season as it's termed, consisting of 13 episodes that thankfully made it out of post-production without obviously being culled in any way, shape or form. And so this is really what remained before obviously we had this so-called final season from Disney that they revived, mainly for money. But it's just obviously good to have some kind of conclusive end to the show now, since the ending really to this was just the fact that Yoda could now commune with the dead, having heard Qui-Gon's voice. And that episode in particular was great. It canonized Darth Bane, which was a great moment in the Clone Wars, and was overall fascinating to see Yoda communicating with the deceased spirit of Qui-Gon, as I would term it. And in terms of the most memorable story arc from this season, easily that would be the Order 66 arc, where Clone Trooper Tup prematurely is set off to execute Order 66, and so with his inhibitor chip malfunctioning, he actually goes ahead and kills one of the Jedi characters during one of the battles. And seeing the sort of end result of that with Clone Trooper 5s and how that heavily links in with the finale episode to Season 7, or the final season, overall, this was an incredible story arc, and for sure one of the most memorable overall out of any story arcs, really, as far as it goes. And yeah, overall, as far as this season goes in general, that was definitely the best sort of arc overall in terms of story. And with this one as well, we also have the 4 additional story reels making up the Crystal Crisis on Utapau, which unfortunately are not finalized animation, but you still get the full story in total. And speaking of the unfinished arcs, I also downloaded onto a DVD-R disc the unfinished reels for the Bad Batch. And I also downloaded all of Season 7, which I managed to get on this one disc, which I'm kind of surprised about, just because I really wanted to have it on hand to watch whenever I wanted to. And so with Disney Plus having not been available in the UK, that was originally my excuse for sort of pirating the episodes. Don't shoot me, Disney. But in all seriousness, if Disney do decide to go ahead and basically make a lucrative marketing choice to bring out some Blu-rays or DVDs for the Clone Wars or the Mandalorian, instantly those will be day one purchases. And so going back to my previous comments about what order you should actually watch the Clone Wars in terms of the chronology with Season 6, you can actually just watch this as one whole piece, really. There's no sort of interchangeable episodes to my recollection. And then once you've watched this, you can then go ahead and watch the unfinished animation reels for Crystal Crisis on Utapau. And then from there, what you would be looking at really is to really get started with Season 7. In between Season 6, you'd have both the Dark Disciple novel and the comic book series for Son of Dathomir. And then for Season 7, order-wise, I would say go for Ahsoka's Walkabout first of all, then The Bad Batch, and then finally, of course, The Siege of Mandalore. But fingers crossed, we will hopefully get more of the Clone Wars at some point in the not too distant future. If you did not know, there are in fact 10 story arcs that never made it to finalized animation that were supposed to be released as multimedia projects, as it was termed. But as of how it stands right now, those have just never been released, so I'm hoping one day they may actually make it into a Lost Missions Volume 2 or some straight to Disney Plus streaming movies. Who knows, but those missing arcs are integral as far as I'm concerned, and you can check out my video discussing that in full for more information surrounding that subject. And just before we leave the Clone Wars series alone in its entirety, I thought I'd give a quick look at the multimedia projects as they are termed. The first of which is, of course, Son of Dathomir, the Darth Maul 4-part comic series, which this is, in my opinion, integral to the Clone Wars story, and it still baffles me that this wasn't produced in finalized animation, particularly because of how integral it is to showing what happens after the events of the duel that took place in Season 5 between Darth Sidious, Maul, and Savage Opress, so it's kind of bizarre. Just knowing that, sadly, a lot of people that will watch the animation just probably won't read too much into the fact of this being exempt from the animated world of Star Wars. But as you can see, obviously, Darth Maul was, in fact, captured, and this is a very unique story showing both Maul and Count Dooku together as apprentices of Sidious, together in the same room, where we also get General Grievous much later on. So to see these characters together is something that is undoubtedly both unfathomable and very unexpected. And that's the unique thing that this comic book does portray, to show how their interactions really do comply to what the story is trying to achieve. And that's something that I would have adored to have seen in animated style. The comic is very good, like I said, but it just would not ever compare to seeing finalized animation for how wonderful these fight sequences and the escape segment would have been. And skipping forward to issue 4, which was my personal favorite issue in this 4-part comic miniseries, overall, as far as the actual build-up of the story goes, the climax, which I personally found to be very intriguing, was the build towards Maul's own personal crusade of his own crime syndicate, which obviously is very heavily sort of explored, I suppose you could term it, in the movie Solo, with the character of Dryden Voss, who is hinted at in the finale, The Siege of Mandalore, thankfully. But the fact that this kind of sets that up and could have really tied things together that little bit more closely, I would have loved to have seen this explored in the new canon almost, with minute changes that would have kept it even more relevant and maybe more concise to the film Solo. So just a couple of things like that I think we've sadly missed out on with this not being present in the final season, or season 7, whichever you prefer to term it as. But yeah, as far as the story goes, I would 100% recommend checking out the comic series, and it gives a very fruitful end to the character of Mother Talzin as well. A brief few words on Dark Disciple, since obviously I don't really have any visuals to provide to compare with the source material, but this was initially intended to be an 8-part story which was going to be split over into 2 separate story arcs, so this would inevitably be the longest set of stories from the Clone Wars TV series as far as episodes go, and for this to be translated into one novel, I think that was definitely the best way to approach this in terms of adding this to the Star Wars canon. In terms of the actual story in itself, obviously this is inevitably the ending of the character of Asajj Ventress, which I won't go into too much detail of, but it's definitely worth reading if you liked her character or were partial to her character in the Clone Wars show. And her team up with the, as I'd term him, the rogue Jedi of Quinlan Vos. He's a character that is very unexplored in the series, and we only really get to see a very intricate look at him when he's paired up with Obi-Wan for the episode where they tried to take down Cad Bane, which is one of my favourites. So for him to be teamed up with Asajj Ventress, they are very mismatched, but also to juxtapose that, a very unique match in terms of what they both provide for one another. So overall, this was a pretty decent read, roughly about 400 pages, I think just shy of. And as far as the story goes, it's definitely worth checking out if you're looking for another story from the world of the Clone Wars. Some great world building, and overall I think the character of Count Dooku is utilised very well throughout this story in particular. So that is Dark Disciple. And so, coming off of Star Wars The Clone Wars, we have the successor series Star Wars Rebels, of which this lasted from 2014 through to 2018 for the 4 seasons you see before you. And as far as a sequel series is concerned, coming off of the Clone Wars, surprisingly this is very cohesive in comparison, and although it does suffer with some very similar problems, especially with this first season, such as the humble beginnings being extremely sort of childlike and very kid-oriented, it does actually grow out of that very quickly, and that's kind of what surprised me about Rebels, as I hadn't actually seen the Clone Wars when I first watched this first season, and so I didn't really know what to expect either way, but I just found this to be quite the breeze to watch. It wasn't really difficult viewing, it was just something, I suppose you could say, really to just have on in the background. And so with that, I really just got quite used to the animation style without knowing really what the Clone Wars animation style was. And that's why I think when most people do say a lot of the animation quality compared to that of the Clone Wars is quite ugly, especially when we have characters that we've known and seen in the Clone Wars transition into Rebels. I just didn't really spot any kind of differentiation or problems with those kinds of looks for some of the characters in this series. And so, all looks aside, as far as the story goes, this first season is overall quite interesting. Also, since I haven't really discussed this series on the channel in depth, I've never really done any kind of reviews for this show at all. I just thought I would go through each individual season and just list off a couple of my favourite episodes, memorable moments, and interesting character points. So with season 1, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the introduction to the major characters in this series. We have Ezra Bridger, who is the Jedi in training under the fallen, I guess, master-style character you could call him, who is Kanan Jarrus, of which we learn a lot more about Kanan really in the comic series, along with some of the novels as well, of which I've not read A New Dawn, but I've got this on my very long list of books to read, and this is definitely something I am looking forward to delving into, especially since Kanan's character is very sort of shadowed in the earlier seasons, but from what we learn about him towards the latter stages of this show, it's overall genuinely quite saddening to know what his character basically becomes from his original past, that he somewhat denies throughout the run of the series, which is an interesting story concept. Next up is Hera Syndulla, who has quite a surprising presence over more or less the entirety of the show. She's a very unique character for the fact of her having a very bizarre kind of on-again, off-again relationship with Kanan. So as a love interest style character, obviously that is quite the conflict between those two, since Kanan is a Jedi, so that's kind of an obvious one. And I also really like her character with her being captain of the smuggling vessel throughout the series called the Ghost. And I love the design of that ship. I really wish I could get the Lego model of that one, but that is a really hard to find set now. It's quite expensive as well, so maybe if they remake it one day, that would be a great one to have in the Star Wars collection. We also have the lovable droid character of Chopper, who, like any astromech droid, doesn't have any sort of dialogue, but is still equally as expressive. Sabine Wren, who is part of Clan Wren from Mandalore, and I think it's quite interesting having a Mandalorian-style character as part of sort of the main kind of protagonists of this series, and her backstory is very well explored throughout, I think, both Season 3 and Season 4. And we also have Zeb Orrelios, who is probably my favourite character of the Ghost crew, and I also quite like his story arc over the seasons, which surprisingly is quite saddening at first, of him being the last of sort of the Lasat people as though he thinks, but that suddenly turns around, and I think his character progression over the seasons is fantastic, and the finale episode really has some great heartwarming moments with his character in particular in the 4th season. But getting back to season 1, overall, this season, it's okay. It's a 15-episode run, and this Blu-ray set is spread over 2 discs there. And as far as sort of interesting stories go, this is more or less just a basic kind of bare-bones kind of build on sort of supply missions and anything to try and fuel the fight of the rebellion sort of going forward. And although very minimal at first, those missions do certainly build and add quite a lot of tension to the characters that we do suddenly grow to love and appreciate. And as far as an ongoing story is concerned, we do actually feature quite a few recurring characters from the original canon, as I would like to call it, such as Grand Moff Tarkin being quite heavily featured in this particular season. And we also have, leading into season 2, Darth Vader coming into this very surprisingly, which I will touch on in just a moment. As far as original characters are concerned, which I actually quite like the concept of, is the Inquisitors, of which we have, as I like to call him, the Grand Inquisitor, who is essentially the main kind of villain for this first season, although I think his character is extremely underused and wasted by the finale episode, which is a shame because I think his character actually had quite an interesting arc where he feared who he was actually working for. And that was really only touched on in just a final sort of conflicted kind of line from his character to Kanan in the final battle at the end of this season. And as we jump into season 2 now, we move into more familiar territory with the villains in this particular season, as Grand Moff Tarkin continues to be a mainstay, and now we have Darth Vader in this season as quite a prominent character, of which he's in quite a lot of the earlier episodes. And although I do kind of disagree with him facing off against our main kind of characters in this season, especially for how he treats Ezra and Kanan, it's certainly well worthwhile seeing him with Ahsoka, which I will discuss in just a moment. Vader, along with the new Inquisitors, which is the next sort of expansion as far as unique characters to Star Wars Rebels are concerned. It's great to see new intricate villains coming off of the minor disappointment we had from Season 1's villain. In comparison to Season 1, this is quite the longer season, with it being 22 episodes in total, spread over 3 Blu-ray discs for this set. And as far as the episodes go, to be honest, this season is a lot more exhilarating than the first, particularly because of all the character reintroductions, as I'd like to term it. So even coming off of the end of Season 1, we have the reintroduction of Ahsoka Tano, who is now obviously an adult in this particular timeline. And then the character cameos kind of sort of continue from there, with characters such as Lando Calrissian making a reappearance in the first couple of episodes. Obviously, with the season progressing more and more, we have Captain Rex and the other troopers that he is with of Gregor and Wolf in the series as well, of which I'm hoping they'll explore those characters in the upcoming Bad Batch series, since we don't know exactly how Wolf and Gregor get to be with Captain Rex in the AT-TE on that planet that they're stuck on. So as far as any storyline like that goes, there's definitely obviously room for expansion. But it's interesting, especially with Darth Vader surprisingly being sort of the main antagonist, along with the new Inquisitors, of which it's kind of revealed that there's a lot more Inquisitors than was really sort of touched upon in the first season, of which the main ones in this particular season are the fifth brother and seventh sister, of which they're okay characters, but I think they are just quite laughable in how easily beaten they are. And I say that because the concept of the Inquisitor, on reflection, really seems very similar to that of Starkiller in The Force Unleashed. And I really, really wish they just touched upon Starkiller, or at least reintroduced him into canon. But I just think he's possibly too powerful of a character from what's reflected in the video games. With that aside, anyhow, that brings me to one of the more interesting plot points of this particular season, and that is the reintroduction of Darth Maul, of which from when this show originally came out, we didn't have obviously the final season of the Clone Wars. We didn't have his cameo in Solo: A Star Wars Story until much later on, so it's very interesting to see Darth Maul's story just randomly pick up. And in the two-parter, which is the two-part finale, Twilight of the Apprentice, that is by far the best episode concept for the entirety of Star Wars Rebels, in my honest opinion. And I love the final beginning of the conflict between Ahsoka and Darth Vader, since obviously Ahsoka has not realized as to what Anakin has become. And finally, in the Twilight of the Apprentice two-parter, she does go to face Anakin as Vader. And that concept alone, I think, was purely one of the best reasons to have this show even in existence, especially with the familiar characters being brought forward. And so from the epic Season 2 finale, we have my personal favourite season of the show, and that is Season 3, where the plot points really do certainly thicken in a lot more depth, to my surprise. And with mainstay characters surprisingly such as Darth Maul, this is an extremely enjoyable season, particularly for his character, since his story definitely does have an interesting direction in terms of a revenge plotline, of which his whole ordeal, which is kind of creepy in some instances, is his absolute obsession with trying to locate Obi-Wan Kenobi, and him actually getting to Tatooine and finding Obi-Wan, obviously knowing that Obi-Wan is the protector of a very young Luke Skywalker, and he just wants to cause mayhem as always. And it's quite interesting as well to see his dynamic with Ezra, who is almost kind of convinced to go towards the dark side. He starts using dark side powers. And one of my favorite moments is from one of the first episodes where Ezra actually uses dark side powers to convince one of the AT-DP pilots to basically walk off a cliff edge. And that kind of sort of structure to using the Force really reminds me of The Force Unleashed once again, just to bring that up. But yeah, as far as character dynamics go, for the protagonist to then be somewhat kind of seduced by the dark side, I thought that was a topic that was very well done. I just wish it had been heavily explored a lot more and maybe had gone even darker. But obviously with the restrictions that Disney did set around this particular show, sadly that just doesn't happen, unfortunately so. And another segment which I'm definitely not forgetting at all is the recanonization of Grand Admiral Thrawn, who was a character originally part of the so-called Thrawn trilogy written by Timothy Zahn many years ago. And with Thrawn being brought back to canon now and sort of reintroduced into this timeline rather than post Return of the Jedi, I think his character is very well utilized and is wonderfully portrayed by Lars Mikkelsen as a very charismatic and cunning tactician, and that is more so only furtherly explored in the new Thrawn trilogy, of which I would 100% recommend reading these books. And the first Thrawn book is fantastic, both for Thrawn's story and once again attaching things to the planet of Lothal, which is heavily explored throughout this series, with that being Ezra's homeworld essentially. But we also get quite the neat backstory in this novel for Governor Price, who is a side character throughout the majority of Rebels, but I think she really does shine in the novel there. So her story is interesting, and it's interesting to give her some backstory for what she is in this show. Just like Season 2, this Blu-ray set has 3 discs in total and has 22 episodes on here. And listing a couple of favourite episodes from Season 3, there are a lot of incredibly memorable ones. Particularly the last battle, which harks back to the Clone Wars, of course, where we see familiar battle droids, including the standardized B-1 battle droids, on screen with stormtroopers, which is something that looks incredibly bizarre, but that's one of the unique additions that Star Wars Rebels as a show adds in terms of expansion to Star Wars as a whole, and that's something that I really do appreciate about this show, by putting unfamiliar territory together just to basically almost see what happens in an experimental kind of way. So that episode in particular was very memorable for that alone. Ghost of Geonosis, which was a great two-parter, which featured the character of Saw Gerrera coming back once again. And his character definitely does develop a lot over the course of Rebels, and obviously for how we see him in Rogue One, I think that's definitely the necessary kind of character exposition. And Ghost of Geonosis is more or less just looking back at what the planet of Geonosis really has become, especially with how we previously saw the Geonosians last, with the whole zombification storyline. And this story particularly just sort of points out the fact that they are not quite extinct and there is still hope for that species, despite obviously the wrongdoings of the species from Attack of the Clones right the way through the Clone Wars. One of the more underrated episodes, I feel, is Through Imperial Eyes, which was definitely game-changing and at least could have been heavily explored a lot more in this style that it provided. The first 2 minutes are quite literally a POV shot from Agent Callus on board a Star Destroyer, sort of mid-battle, or at least mid-call to a battle, as we see stormtroopers rushing through the corridors, and the way the POV shot is done for animation. I really do wish the entirety of the episode had been done in that style, even though that is kind of a sort of Mr. Robot kind of visual technique to do. I just think that would have been a game-changing episode, and definitely would have made it a sort of high-ranking episode, with this being sort of the final kind of reveal of Agent Callus being the secret informant to the Rebels of Fulcrum. Twin Sons, again, I've already referenced this episode in particular, but overall, as far as a finale kind of conflict is concerned between Maul and Kenobi, or mending an old wound, as Kenobi points out in the episode, this was overall quite an exhilarating moment, and even though it was a very short-lived lightsaber battle, which personally I didn't take too kindly to, but having watched a couple of interviews with voice actor for Darth Maul, Sam Witwer, just listening to his breakdown of that lightsaber duel, it definitely changed my mind on a couple of points, and made me appreciate it a little bit more. So if you weren't as appreciative of that lightsaber fight, I would definitely recommend looking up the interviews where he speaks quite highly of that particular moment. And the finale two-parter, which is 0 Hour, where we see both Grand Admiral Thrawn strike back against the rebel cells, as well as the secretive character voiced by Tom Baker of the Bendu, who was featured more so towards the beginning of this season, who was speaking really to Kanan and Kanan alone about the difference and parallels between the light and dark, and that his character was basically the liminality between light and dark. And I loved the moment towards the latter stages of this story where Kanan really pisses off the Bendu just by bringing war to the peaceful planet. and the confusion as to what the Bendu is. It's not really explored as to what Bendu is at all, but it's just really unique to see Grand Admiral Thrawn quite confused as well, but also very curious, asking what manner of creature are you? And the dialogue in that particular exchange is really sinister between him and the Bendu, as well as the foreshadowing of the series finale is given to us quite literally. And with season 4, the final season, of course, I found this to be a very satisfying conclusion to a story that definitely does come leaps and bounds compared to what it was in season 1. And that's definitely a huge advantage to these animated shows, where the characters really do grow and progress. Even with the Clone Wars, we see that very significantly, and that is replicated very well with Star Wars Rebels. And so providing conclusive ends to the characters that we have grown to love within this series, overall I found it to be extremely satisfying, and the amount of lore that they introduce into the world of Star Wars from this final season alone is overall incredible. And I'm particularly talking about the World Between Worlds episode, which surprisingly introduces the idea of time travel into Star Wars. And the way they execute that, it may or may not be how you are possibly thinking of it if you haven't seen this before, in which the World Between Worlds is literally as you would expect, and it's more or less all the major events of the Skywalker saga as accessible gateways, and the way they utilize that is to bring back the character of Ahsoka, and definitely coming off of Twilight of the Apprentice from Season 2, wrapped up that major story thread that we were left as kind of sort of a cliffhanger in that season, so I'm very glad they did revisit that with this final season. And what also interested me about the latter episodes was bringing back Emperor Palpatine as the main villain for those last few episodes, who was voiced by Ian McDiarmid, and it was an absolute pleasure to hear Ian McDiarmid speak the names of Kanan, Ezra, and Ahsoka, just really hitting home just how much of an impact these kinds of characters really have had in terms of the animated world of Star Wars. And Ian McDiarmid, as always, as the Emperor, he's such a dastardly villain, regardless of whether or not it's just his voice or not. I just think he does an incredible job as the Emperor, regardless. And in this season as well, speaking of voice acting, Malcolm McDowell, surprisingly, had a cameo appearance as the character of Minister Hayden, who may look slightly familiar to you. He was originally supposed to be Vader's servant from Rogue One, but with Hayden having to sort of die in Rebels, it didn't make sense to retcon the role in Rogue One that came before this in terms of the chronological timeline that these shows and films actually came out, so it was better to have it as a separate character. And I really did enjoy Minister Hayden as a character, with him being quite an overly critical kind of art critic and architect. And his conversations with Sabine, although he was quite sinister, but then again quite charismatic as well, he was definitely someone that I think could have had a lot more layers and a lot more character development if he had been kept on a lot longer. But sadly, he was only featured for a couple of episodes. But either way, I think his character was definitely worthwhile having, and was overall a pleasure to see in this story, where he is trying to unlock the portal to the world between worlds. And his study of the art that we see of the Mortis gods, obviously bringing once again some Clone Wars lore back into the animated world of Star Wars in this show. It was fantastic to see the 2D animations of the Mortis gods themselves. And the way they were trying to study these old interpretations was definitely one of my favourite moments. And in terms of the ending, the finale was quite interesting. Of course, we have Ezra's story wrapped up quite tightly for the moment. And I say for the moment because it's heavily rumoured that there will be a Rebels sequel series with both Thrawn and Ezra basically being put into suspension rather than actually having anything final happen to their characters. And with that kind of potential, I do not think for 1 minute that will be left unexplored. I'm sure a Rebels sequel series, despite it only being a rumour at the moment, is definitely going to happen. And that's why I think with the sort of epilogue that we have in the finale episode, we see the ending with both Sabine and Ahsoka post Return of the Jedi, and that was definitely a great move in terms of actually wrapping up this story. And that definitely does make me feel the sequel series is not too far away, with those two characters perhaps being sort of the protagonists of an upcoming series about saving Ezra. And with that said, that wraps up the origin story of Ezra Bridger from Star Wars Rebels. The series itself, I definitely think this is a worthy successor to the Clone Wars and does stand on its own 2 feet. And in terms of a follow-up, I definitely think there are some great moments throughout this series that hardcore Clone Wars fans will really enjoy. But it's a series in itself that I think even a casual fan could find a lot of appreciation from, in terms of tying in some of the loose ends from the films, and overall just adding some very entertaining stories to the world of Star Wars as a whole. And finally, to wrap up this video, I thought I would briefly touch on the Clone Wars miniseries by Genndy Tartakovsky, and also briefly talk about the Star Wars prequel films, both of which I have done individual reviews on. You can check out my prequel trilogy review and the Tartakovsky review. I'll throw links in the description down below, of course. But to touch on the Clone Wars miniseries prior to the prequels, this is essentially a 2-hour animated movie made up of shorts that were released really just before Star Wars Episode 3 debuted in cinemas. And as far as these animations go, to be honest, they are absolutely gorgeous. They are very hypnotic, especially from Volume 1 in particular, which is the main draw, as far as the first volume is concerned. Which really leads me on to why personally I don't really think this has the most rewatchability. It's not really something I would plan to check out ever again after the initial watch. It was overall very good, and the animation style is certainly something that I am a very big fan of. However, it didn't really have much of a story going for it, more like hints of stories, such as the takedown of the Kaleesh warrior character, Dooku training both Ventress and General Grievous, which then leads us into the second volume, which the events of which take place much closer to Revenge of the Sith. And this is basically Anakin going on a spiritual journey of self-discovery almost, where he basically discovers himself as the hints lead towards him becoming Darth Vader. And then obviously in episode 3 we witness that downfall. But other than that, this is definitely the most dialogue-driven part of the 2 volumes, and is for sure a lot more enjoyable for the additional moments, such as the origin of how General Grievous gained his sort of asthmatic cough almost, if you will, with his chest being literally crushed by Mace Windu, which was unfortunately omitted from the CGI animated TV series. Likewise with the kidnapping of Chancellor Palpatine, which I would have absolutely have loved to have seen brought into the Siege of Mandalore somehow. But other than that, this is definitely unique for those plot points in particular, and even though these are considered now to be no longer canon to Star Wars, I would 100% recommend giving them a look in. And if you want to hear my more in-depth thoughts on these 2 volumes, you can check out my review like I said before. And as far as the prequel trilogy is concerned, my thoughts on these movies really have retained the same more or less. The only differing fact would really be with Revenge of the Sith because of the Siege of Mandalore finale story arc, and that's literally because that story takes place in time with the events of this film. So, for example, we have the beheading of Count Dooku and Obi-Wan reporting this to Ahsoka, and one of my favourite moments is when Obi-Wan says that he's going to challenge General Grievous. That's definitely one of the more interesting factors. And then obviously Order 66 taking place literally in time with the Order 66 that we know of from this film. It's overall fascinating to see these timelines converge, especially with other mediums such as the video game Jedi Fallen Order as well, which there's loads of wonderful compilation videos out there on YouTube showing all 3 sides that we know of now of Order 66. And I'm sure if more Clone Wars content is touched upon in the future, maybe we'll see more sides to Order 66, but otherwise, as far as the trilogy goes, I've always found Phantom Menace to be oddly nostalgic, but more or less is rendered as a pretty pointless movie, aside from setting up characters such as Qui-Gon, really. And yeah, for Anakin to be so young, I think he's too young in this movie. They definitely should have upped the age bracket for his character to fit in more closely with the love and revenge storyline from episode 2, of which we have a very conflicted Anakin who is madly in love with Padme Amidala, who obviously we see for the first time in Phantom Menace, but together they've basically sort of grown apart, sort of as they've grown up, if that makes sense. So they meet really again for the first time almost, which is kind of bizarre to witness, especially with Hayden Christensen's very wooden acting in this movie, unfortunately. But yeah, as far as that goes, it's very interesting to see that love dynamic kind of sort of progress, even if it is as cringy as hell. And then, of course, we have the revenge side of that story where Anakin slowly descends down this dark path as we see him take revenge on the Sand People, for example, for murdering his mother. So those kind of flashback scenes and kind of stuff like that, visions of the future almost, those are some of the more interesting aspects of this film. But overall, it's a very incoherent movie. The only coherent moments that I do quite like is the Cypher Dyas stuff, which is heavily explored in the Clone Wars, ordering a clone army 10 years prior, so obviously that keeps things in line with the events of this film. And then obviously the Battle of Geonosis with the ferocious animals, the clone troopers, the battle droids, loads of great stuff there, but other than that, there's not really much, in my opinion, that redeems this movie. Even with later entries such as Solo and The Last Jedi, it's still my least favourite Star Wars movie, sadly. And then again, Revenge of the Sith, it's a movie that I've grown to love a lot more, and the acting, in all honesty, from rewatching this, especially after watching it from having seen the Clone Wars finale, I enjoyed this a lot more for the acting, especially from Hayden Christensen, bizarrely, which conflicts my point from the original review I did of all three movies. I still stand by my thoughts on pretty much all the acting in Attack of the Clones being quite wooden. But there's a lot of great moments in Revenge of the Sith, especially the moment where Padme tells Anakin that she is pregnant. I adore the sort of facial expressions and the lack of dialogue in that sequence in particular. And yeah, there's loads of great moments throughout this film as well that I could also gush about. So thanks for watching my collection overview of the animated world of Star Wars. I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy, please do leave a like down below. If you have any suggestions for other collection videos, you can drop me a comment as well. And for more videos, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.
Are you threatening me?